as a church, I was thinking about this the other day. I got to invite somebody to one of our services, and she asked the question. She said, if I just wake out and I just roll out of bed late and I show up in my pajamas, will anybody care? And I was like, I hope they won't, because if I ever had that happen, I would probably do the same thing. And I was thinking, this is what I said to her. We as a church, we want to be a place where people are always welcome and never pressured. You're just always welcome, but we don't want you to feel pressure. This is a place for you to connect with God. And I think God's going to honor that, where people are going to feel safe to come out and check out God and learn about who he is. And what that means for us as a church is part of helping people to grow in Jesus Christ is for us to have a desire and a passion to form new relationships. Because if we only know the people that we know and we never reach out and we never connect with new people, we're not really taking part in what the Bible calls the Great Commission, or what we call the Great Commission, where we're reaching new people for Jesus Christ. And so I bring that up because I think as we grow, we need to have eyes and hearts for people who don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, who don't maybe know anything about him, and this can be a place for them to say, hey, I've been searching for God. I think maybe there's more to life than I've found, and so I want to come and I want to find out if he's real. And for that to happen, we need to have people who are excited about the potential for new relationships. And we were talking about this in our Connect class this morning. What you see in the Bible is the people who are out there spreading the message of God's love. They face a tension that they wouldn't face if they weren't actively pursuing new relationships for God. And the tension is that they wish they had more time to spend with the people that they loved while they're out reaching new people. If you read the letters that Paul writes to the churches, repeatedly he's going, I wish I could be with you. I wish I was there. I wish that I could be present with you. I can't, so I'm sending this guy. He's going to be with you. But there's always this longing for him to enjoy more of the relationships that he already has. But for the sake of the gospel, he's out trying to make new. And so for me, I want you to understand that as we move forward with what God has called us to as a church to look to try to reach people, that might mean that you might be in the same tension that Paul and Peter were when they led the church initially. The tension that while they were excited about the new people they were reaching, they also had this tension of, God, I wish I had more time to spend with the ones that I already knew. I always say this, if we're in the same place that the guys who founded the church were, philosophically, that's a good place. If we're having the same troubles that they're having and seeing the same results they're having, that's a good place to be. So I just want to pray for that and pray that as we move forward, that God allows us to have strong relationships, but also new ones for Jesus Christ. Lord, I love you and I praise you for everything you made except for coffee. I don't know what that was about. But other than that, Lord, you're incredible. And I ask that we would be a church that faces the tension of there's so many people who want to know about you that it's tough for us to know everyone. And that goes against some of our desire for community and our desire for family. I pray that you would help us to find that anyway. I pray that you would guide us to what that looks like, even if there are more people that come here to praise your name. We ask that in your son's name. Amen. So we're in this series called Battle Within. Battle Within, the whole idea is that we're not always who we want to be in life. That there's sometimes a disconnect with who we think we should be and who we are. And specifically internally, there are things that upset us, there are things that weigh us down, there are things that frustrate us, things that challenge us, and we're not always okay with that. And so we have this sort of inner turmoil, and it's nothing new. If you were to go back and study secular philosophers or religious philosophers, you'd see as far back as you can go, this inner turmoil is a part of man. In fact, I came across the writings from a secular philosopher named Epictetus, who comes from 2nd century Rome, and he's writing from a time of relative peace where Rome is really doing quite well. And this is what he says. He says, Caesar can free people from wars and fighting, but not from envy. Caesar can free people from wars and fighting, but not from envy. And what a fascinating insight, because Rome at this point, again, is a time that what was relative ease. They had most of what they wanted. And he's going, look, Caesar can take all of the external issues that you've got problems with, but he cannot free you from envy. The Bible talks about this a ton. And in the book of James, where we're going to be this morning, in James chapter 4, James refers to this person as a double-minded person, as a divided self. And he's really trying to sort out the mystery of why our external relationships are not all that they could be. And he's going to hone in on the fact that the external relationships aren't what they could be because the internal reality isn't what it should be. That what goes on around us is not just everybody else's fault, that my own heart has something to do with it. And what we're going to look at specifically this morning, as we've kind of been looking at this subject throughout the whole series, this morning we're going to specify in on the issue of anger. What's interesting is most people either say, yeah, I've got a real problem with anger, or no, I don't have a problem with anger. And I would guess every one of us does. It just maybe looks a little bit differently. But anger is a big part of every one of our lives, and it usually shows up in either an attack or antisocial behavior. It's either I'm going to get you, I'm going to hurt you in response to how you hurt me, or I'm going to withdraw, I'm going to punish you with the lack of my love towards you. So it'll be an attack or it'll be antisocial. It'll either be direct, indirect, or redirected. Have you ever done that? Like you get angry at someone, instead of directing your anger towards them, you turn around and you hit the wall, or you yell at the dog, or you do something to redirect your anger. It's either aggressive, or it's passive aggressive. What James and what God ultimately want us to know is that all of these, no matter how you uniquely respond to anger, every one of these will have a damaging effect on the relationships that you're around, that are around you in life. God is immensely interested in your home life, your work relationships, your friends, and your enemies, because God is immensely interested in interpersonal relationships. He's incredibly interested in this. If you don't believe me, you can pick up the Bible, and at any point, you're not going to get very far before you find the fact that God is speaking to someone about how they should interact with someone. In fact, if you read the Old Testament, you're reading along, and you've got kind of this big narrative going on in the Old Testament where God's setting the stage for the Messiah, Jesus, to come on earth. And within this overall narrative, there's all these like seemingly unimportant stories that keep coming out, where like so-and-so was offended by so-and-so, and they did this in response. And then really it kind of reads like an episode of like The Bachelor at times, where it's like, what's going on? There's so many characters here, and they're attacking each other. What are they doing? There's so much drama. And God puts that in there because he wants us to see his heart for interpersonal relationships and how they're navigated poorly and how they're navigated well. If you pick up the Bible and you read it in the New Testament, you've just got statement after statement of how we should interact with one another. Think of all the, if you're familiar with the Bible, think of all the statements about love in the New Testament. All of those statements are meant to have a home in your life. This is not like theoretical teaching about love that you should just understand in your head. Every time the Bible addresses the topic of love, the idea is it has a home in your marriage. It has a home in your relationship with your neighbors. It has a home in your relationship with your in-laws. That love is not an idea, but love is something that's actual and lived out. And God goes back to this concept again and again because it's a primary concern of his. And so in the book of James, God is frustrated about conflict in the church. I'm actually not going to tell you what the conflict in the church was, because we're going to talk about that next week. So if you want to find out what the conflict is in the book of James, come back next week. We'll talk about it next week. That's my teaser. This week, we're going to focus on the concept. And what God wants to be clear is that everybody's going to say it's everybody else's fault. And God's going to go, no. In every situation where you're angry, you've got ownership. You've got something that you're responsible for. And that conflict is going to go right to our heart. And God is sending this message to James, which is pretty stern, because this church, they're just tearing each other apart over this issue, which we'll talk about next week. They're just tearing each other apart so much so that he's going to call him my brother, and he's going to speak metaphorically and say, why are you killing each other? James has just talked about the power of words and how the words can just cut and kill. And he goes, why are you employing it? Why are you putting it into practice and against each other of all people? James 4, verse 1 through 3. He says, where do the conflicts and where do the quarrels amongst you come from? Is it not from this? from your passions that battle inside you. You desire and do not have. You murder and envy and you cannot obtain. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you are wrong. You ask wrongly so you can spend it on your passions. I know we prayed, but that was to get rid of the coffee flavor. We're going to pray again for God to teach us this morning. Lord, I pray that as we look at this concept in the book of James and we look at anger and what causes it and our response to it and your solution to it, I just pray that you would guide us, that our kids would benefit from this truth, that the people that we work alongside would benefit from this truth, that the person who cuts us off on the highway going home would benefit from this truth. And we ask that in your son's name. Amen. I love the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is all about wisdom. And wisdom to me, I taught young adults for a number of years, and often I'd get together with young men specifically and talk about wisdom with them. And one of the young men in particular, he was kind of caught up on the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And he's like, I know about life a lot, but I keep making the wrong choices. And I said, wisdom is this. Wisdom is if you picture yourself 20 years from now, and you say, what would I have done differently 20 years from now? And you're looking back, what would I have done differently? And you do it now. You live in light of what you actually value that God would have taught you in the future. You live in light of that now. And so what I hope and what I pray is that this message brings a wisdom and understanding. Not that so 20 years from now you can say, man, I was angry all those years. Wow, that really did mess with things around me. So I hope that you can say for the next 20 years, I'm going to make a dedicated effort to not be an angry person because of God's strength in me. That's wisdom. Right? Proverbs goes on to say that a wise man or a wise woman, you could say that as well, understands the depths of their soul. So in a message like this, my hope is that you don't look at the person next to you and say, they've got an anger issue. No, I want you to look within, because that's what James does. And so if you want to understand the depths of your soul, if you really want to know the depths of your soul, here's a question you need to ask of yourself. How do you respond when you don't get what you want? How do you respond when you don't get what you want? Well, that'll tell you a lot about yourself. And I hope you don't just answer that right now in your head of, I'm cool with it. No, but just think about it throughout this week. How do you respond when you don't get what you want? When you want to be respected and instead you're disrespected. When you want to belong, you want to feel included and instead you're left out. When you want to be listened to and heard and valued and trusted, but you're not. How do you respond when you don't get what you want? And what James is going to try to do is open your eyes to the reality that much of this struggle that we have in relationships around us is the result of internal conflict more than external inconvenience. It's the result of internal conflict more than external inconvenience. So the other day, I'm teaching the boys how to do a project. We're refinishing this old antique sewing desk, and we're sanding it down. And when one of the boys doesn't listen for the 8th time, and I lose my temper and I yell at him, James is saying, don't just look at him in the situation, look at your heart. What did you want that you didn't get? When we're on the airplane on vacation and we've got to rush from one flight to the other and everybody else is taking their good old time to get off the flight and we're in the back and we're just sitting there, I'm like, can't you just pick up your stuff and go? Can't you, it's not, I'll even come up and get it for you. You just walk, I'll carry it all off. This is a better way to do it. James is saying, don't just look at everybody else, look, but what did you want inside? Or even when you get off the plane in the airport, in some genius schematics of how they laid out the flight, puts my flight that leaves in 10 minutes, 20 minutes away on the other side of the airport. Oh, that's awesome. Good. Yes, we can't even do that, right? And so anger, we're prone to look at anger and blame other things, either people or inanimate objects or systems, because we'll say things like a stupid flight or stupid Delta or stupid United. That's a thing. A thing can't be smart or dumb. And what I'm trying to do is to push my anger elsewhere. Have you ever been in a bad mood and just not even known it? Just not even know why, and just I don't know why I'm in a bad mood. You know what James and what God through James does? He gives us a concrete reason for our abstract anger. He gives it to us. Concrete reason for our abstract anger. If you want to know why you're upset, you don't have what you want. You didn't get your way. And when I read this initially, when I studied this, it was because I had a young man who went through a motorcycle accident. He was recovering from that, and he was dealing with some issues in recovery, and he was getting angry a lot. And he said, "Pastor Matt, will you meet with me and help me to overcome the issue of anger?" And I was like, "Well, I'll try. I never get angry. I never struggle with that." I'm just kidding. I was like, I'll try. And I started to learn, and I read this book on anger. I studied it in Scripture, and like I read this concept that I'm angry because I don't get what I want, and I was like, no, that's it can't be that simple. Like, there's got to be more to it. Other people have got to be responsible. There's got to be something here. It's not that I didn't get what I wanted. And then I started to live life, and I was like, I'm angry. Why am I? Oh, because I didn't get what I wanted. Because I wanted my son to respect my words and listen to me the first time instead of the 8th time, right? Because I wanted the people to move faster so that I could get off the plane. Because I wanted Delta to rearrange all their flights so that my schedule was perfect. I didn't get what I wanted. And again, what I found was that this is true. That if I would get upset with my spouse or my kids, it would ultimately come back to, I wanted something, and I did not get it. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were telling a story about their friend and somebody who was angry with their friend, and they had this response to an angry person that just was classic, and he goes, "I'm sorry, man, it's your world, I'm just living in it." It's your world, I'm just living in it. Well, that's what anger is. Anger is, this is my world. And you're messing up my world. You're messing up what I got going on. Every expression of anger is the result of an inward anxiety over not getting our way. Every expression of anger is the result of an internal anxiety that I didn't get my way. And you know what I didn't like when I found this truth in God's Word? I didn't like that it made me feel like a little boy not getting what he wanted for dinner. I didn't like that because it showed me how childlike I was on the inside when I didn't get what I wanted. So if I were to ask that question, how do I respond when I don't get what I want? I would answer it like this. I'd respond like the 8-year-old version of Matt Saxinger. And I would whine. I would just have a more cleaned up way of presenting it. Right? I would just have a more adultified version of how I respond in that instance. And so some of you who are like Bible people and you've come to church your entire life, you're going like, what about righteous anger? Like, can't anger be a good thing? And I'm going to answer that in 1 second because 99.99% of the time I've interacted with anger, with counseling and other times, it's not been righteous anger, okay? So it's just, you might be the 0.01%, but righteous anger, this is it. All right, righteous anger is not when you're upset because you didn't get what you wanted. It's you're upset because God didn't get what he wanted. Now here's the trick to that. It also means you respond in the way that God would if he were in your shoes. But the dad who gets furious because his kids aren't acting the way God wants, and he's responding to them in an ungodly way, you're a child. You're a child. Right? Righteous anger says, this is what God wanted, and I'm going to respond in God's way with patience, with kindness, with mercy, with grace. But if you're the dad or if you're the husband that doesn't get your way and you flip out, like, I'm sorry, but you're a little boy. And I love you, but I'm going to be bold because I've seen enough families dissolve because of it. So Proverbs says, the angry man is like a city without walls. It's open to attack at any point from any directions. And James wants us to know that we are prone to anger because we don't get what we want. Douglas Moo says it this way. He says, frustrated desire breeds strife. Frustrated desire breeds strife. He goes on to say that verbal argument, private violence, or national conflict, the cause of them all can be traced back to the wrongful lust to have more, to want more than we have. Even on a national level, he says, we wanted something and we didn't get it. And so the irony this church would be saying, it's your fault, it's your fault. Well, that's because of this over here, that's because of that over there. And James goes, no. Turn the finger around and point at yourself. See, we have this reality where we say, if they didn't act that way, if they didn't do this, if everybody met my conditions for life, I wouldn't be angry. If everybody met my agenda, then I wouldn't be upset. Our heart places conditions on our happiness where if we get what we want from everybody around us, then we won't get angry. We'll be happy. And what James wants to do is James wants to free you from this. Because you'll constantly have an agenda that's shifting and an anger that's presenting. Either antisocial or aggressive, whatever, it'll come back repetitively in your life. Because any threat, if your agenda is the chief thing on your heart and on the throne of your heart, any threat to it will be an attempt to hijack what is most important to you, your way. Any time the kids don't do what they're supposed to do, it will derail what your heart's agenda was. I remember one time walking through a crowded shopping center. I hate shopping, especially at Christmas. Amazon is my best friend. And I remember at this crowded shopping place around Christmas, this woman kind of rudely cuts me off, and I made like a sigh or some sort of, and she says to her husband, "Well, he's easily perturbed." And I was thinking like, yeah, she's actually kind of right. Even though she was rude, she's right. Like this, I want to live in a way where that isn't so important to me, that it causes me to be angry. And if my plans are on the throne, then every little thing is going to come along and it's going to steal something precious to me. And that's my way, or what I thought was going to happen. And what James is trying to get them to do is to come to the point where they realize that our happiness cannot be determined by whether or not our agenda is completed the way we want. He wants us to find a greater treasure in life. And the real art to life is to treasure God's love when we lose lesser treasures. To treasure God's love when we lose lesser treasures. Okay, I treasured my kids listening to me. Well, they didn't. Okay. My world does not collapse at this point. Like, what happens to me eternally does not hinge upon this. There's a greater treasure that's unaffected in the middle of my agenda being inconvenienced. And so James is redirecting our eyes. He goes on to say, God gives grace to the humble and he opposes the proud, because he wants us to see that the root of anger is ultimately pride, the demand to have our own way. And what he wants us to see is that you having your own way and pride will not satisfy you, but rather it's God who does. And Ephesians 3 talks about God's love. This is where I want your heart to go when you're angry, for you to treasure God's love for you. I pray that according to the wealth of God's glory, that he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner person, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, so that because you have been rooted and grounded in love, you may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and thus to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. But what if our heart treasured that when our package didn't get delivered the time we wanted? When we got cut off on the highway? If we were just like, yeah, I wanted to drive uninterrupted right now, but the reality is God's love for me is uninterrupted. And so like my agenda might change, but while our plans shift, God's don't. And here's where that's huge, because God has planned to love you. If you're a child of God and you place faith in him, he's planned to love you. And whatever has inconvenienced you that has caused the situation of anger, whatever has caused that internal battle, that has not altered God's love of you. Your inconveniences don't alter God's love any more than a fly in the path of a tractor trailer. A tractor trailer can go down the road and hit thousands of flies, and it doesn't stop, it doesn't slow down, it just keeps going. Whatever inconvenience you experience in life does not slow down God's love for you. And your heart has to be tied to a greater treasure and not a lesser one of your own agenda. If you do that, if you shift and you put God's agenda and God's pursuit of you on the throne instead of your own pursuit of your own agenda, what I think you'll find is that we'll respond in grace more than anger. We'll respond in grace more than anger. Why? Because we're consumed with his love. And it didn't matter that you didn't listen to me. It didn't matter that you didn't get out of my way. It didn't matter if I missed a flight. Because I have not missed out on your love for me. justify grace more than you justify anger. Do you ever talk to somebody and try and justify your anger? Well, if they would just move, and maybe if they would think about everybody else in the plane, if they just got their head out, they would say, hey, anybody have a quick flight? You can all go. We justify our anger. What if we justified our grace? What if you talked yourself into grace? You did mess up. You're right. But you know what? I messed up a couple times too. I remember one of the times I was angriest in life. It involves food, not surprisingly. But I went and I got a cheesesteak from a restaurant, takeout, and got the whole family cheesesteaks, and we got home, and mine was messed up. And so I drive back, get it, and they messed it up again. Drive back, I'm not making this up, I get it, and they messed it up again. I'm like, how hard is the word no sauce? How hard is that phrase to remember? Right? I could write it down for you if you want. I'm so angry. I wanted to shut the place down. This is ridiculous. Anybody coming in here, they're going to mess your order up. I didn't actually do this. I just wanted to. This was in my heart. What I'm arguing for is the way that we talk ourselves into anger, the way that we build that. Why don't we build grace? If I'd be like, you know what, they messed up 3 times. I at least messed up 3 times in my whole life for God, right? He had to be patient with me 3 times once. It's actually probably not true. It's probably every day ever. What if I was like, you know what? I mess up a ton. And God still loves me. I should give them grace. And you know what? They might even take advantage of it. Good. I probably would too. And I'm going to talk myself into being more gracious. Because naturally I want to go to that anger. I want to go to that defend and guard my own agenda as opposed to talking myself into being more gracious. We've become experts at talking ourselves into gracious responses instead of angry ones. If you want help in that path, in that journey of becoming more gracious and less anger, James makes a connection that I think is really important for us. He goes for, it seems kind of disjointed when you look at it, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. James goes, you don't have because you don't want, that's why you kill, that's why you argue, that's why you covet, you're not getting what you want. And then he goes, and talk about your prayers. You're praying for the wrong stuff and you're not getting it. And it seems like these 2 different things. But what James is saying, I believe, is that our passions follow our prayers. Our passions follow our prayers. And I think what he's saying here is that you have a passion for yourself, and so you've been praying for yourself and you're not getting it. And God's not going to answer your prayer to align you with lesser allegiances. God's not going to give you an answer to a prayer to let you drift less independence away from him or to chase after something else. He's just not going to do that. And I think what James is doing here is to say, if you want to recapture your heart to be more gracious, you need to come back to what you pray for and ask yourself, what do I pray for in life? Because God's not a genie in a bottle. He's not just here to grant us all our wishes to guard or to gain our own agenda in life. God's got a greater agenda that we should align with. And our prayers have a means of aligning our passions with it. This is where James says that we squander our prayers. You just waste them. It's a reference back to the story of the prodigal son, where the boy gets his inheritance and he goes and he spends it all. In a short amount of time, just wastes it. And he comes home and he finds what he had always been looking for, waiting for him. Value, belonging, forgiveness, grace, and mercy. As if to say, what you were looking for is right here. If you would have found God, you would have found what you were always looking for. What are you really chasing after in life? Because I bet it's in God more than it's everywhere else. And when you understand that and you say, then I'm going to follow God and I'm going to let him, in the end, give me the things that I long for, what you'll find is you're free from having your own agenda on the throne. And you can line yourself up with a greater purpose and a greater passion. We're gonna. I keep referring back to next week because I want to be sensitive. We've got communion here, and I want us to focus on this concept of our anger and looking at God's grace as a response to it. I read a poem this week from a poet named William Blake. And William Blake is writing this poem. He originally entitled this poem Christian Forbearance to address the issue of anger in the church, looking at bitterness and resentment. And read along with me what he says here. He says, I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath, and my wrath did end. In other words, I was angry, and I told him about it. We talked through it, and we worked it out. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with my smiles and with soft deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night till it bore an apple bright. And my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine, and into my garden stole. When the night had veiled the pole, in the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. You're either a person that brings life or brings death to others. Anger will bring death. And what William Blake is getting us to see is the reality that anger doesn't just change the external situations of the people around us, but it changes us. And it turns us into a version of ourselves that I don't think we want to be at the end of the day. The type of person who can enjoy the demise of someone else. And when you can enjoy the demise of someone else, I think that's very far from what the gospel calls us to. To be a person who sees even the hardest, furthest away from God and says, I want that person to praise you, Jesus Christ. Even if they've wronged me, even if they've been my enemy. I hope that we can be a church that sees anger for what it is, a childlike response to guard our own agenda. And I hope we can see a greater response, the very response that God himself poured out to us on the cross. Response of grace. As we turn our thoughts to communion, communion is a time for us to remember and reflect what God has done, to anticipate the return of Jesus Christ, and until then to live in light of it. I was thinking through this, there's a line at the beginning of the communion phrase that we repeat, and it says, on the night that he was betrayed. And I thought about this in context with what we've been looking at, on the night that he was betrayed. That Jesus was the recipient of someone else's anger. And he, the great peacemaker, absorbed it, endured it, and experienced death so that we could find life. What communion is incredibly personal. It's a time for you to say, I personally am thankful and appreciative of what Jesus has done by making peace for me, between me and God. And so I'm going to remember that. I'm going to reflect that. If you're still searching for who Jesus is, it would make sense for you to wait and celebrate for a time when you figure that out. But at the same time, I want to invite you to say that in your journey, I hope there's a point where you recognize that Jesus himself did something very deeply personal for you at great cost to himself so that you could find great benefit with him forever. It's as simple as saying, Jesus, I believe that what you did on the cross, by dying for sins, you died for my sins. And when you rose from the grave, you give me the hope that I'll rise from the grave. And Jesus in John 14 says, whoever believes in me will live even after they die. Not the person who does good things, not the person who comes to church, but whoever believes in me will live even after they die.